We want to welcome you officially to this great event um, on faith and feeling. So before I bring our speaker to the foreground, let me just welcome you again to this event. I'm Sherry Kling, Director of Process and Faith, and Jared Morningstar is also with us, who is our Director of Communications for the Center for Process Studies, and he's going to be supporting this event regarding the technology side. And if you're not, raise your hand if this is your first Process and Faith event. Anybody first timer? Great. Don, welcome. Christian, welcome. Very good. I've seen some of you. I've seen Christian before in other events. I'm not sure if I've seen Don. Maybe. But welcome. We're so glad that you're here with us and that you found us and found this event. And we're eager to share this content with you. Process and Faith is a multi-faith network of relational spirituality for the common good. We have, and you will be in our communications after you've signed up for this event, but we do a monthly newsletter and have different ongoing learning circles that typically meet monthly, or there are reading groups that meet more frequently than that, maybe weekly. But we've got lots of things going on, and so you can just go to our website and check out those events, or you'll probably be receiving our newsletter, and you can see the listings of different things that are coming up in that. I will mention a couple of things. On October 17th, our next event is under what we call our Interweavings umbrella, and it's an event with myself and Rabbi Lila Berner talking about sacred practices and dynamic texts. So we both have been very interested in the Christian practice of Lectio Divina, but Rabbi Berner took that practice and turned it into a Jewish practice. And so we're going to be talking about how these kinds of practices can bring new life to ancient texts and to one's spiritual life. So that's October 17th. And then, Jared's put that link in the chat. And then we've got a new learning circle starting on October 22nd called Process and Presence, where Jay McDaniel is here in this event, and he and Raren Gumbel, the leader of the Milwaukee Zen Center, will be having this ongoing learning circle to talk about the intersection of process and Zen Buddhism. We have another group that focuses on a different thread of Buddhism, and that meets monthly. We also have a Christian process explorations group that meets monthly. So anyway, lots going on. But without further ado, I want to start our event for this evening with an introduction of our speaker. So Chad Bahl is our speaker for tonight, and he is a candidate for a doctorate in theology and ministry at Northwind Theological Seminary. And he specializes in the study of open and relational theology, which is an umbrella under which process theology sits. And he is the author of several books: God Unbound and Evangelical Reconsiders Tradition in Search of Truth. He's also the author and editor of Deconstructing Hell, Open and Relational Responses to the Doctrine of Eternal Conscious Torment, and that's a collection of multiple essays. And then most recently, his book Mornings with Schleiermacher, a devotional inspiration inspired by the father of modern theology. And he'll be, I'm sure, touching base with many of the ideas in that book tonight. So with that, let's welcome Chad Bahl. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Sherry. Thank you, Jared. Thank you for the invitation. Just an honor to be with you guys. And this is my second. I'm privileged for this to be my second process pop-up with this group. When Deconstructing Hell first came out last year, I was honored to be able to speak in front of the group and talk about Deconstructing Hell and some of the main thoughts behind it. And it was just an honor. So as Sherry mentioned, I'm currently a doctoral candidate at Northwind Theological Seminary. I study under Thomas J. Ord. And my goal is to get my doctorate in theology and ministry and open and relational theology. So, um, I guess, just briefly, what brought me into process theology, and many people have, different journeys to process, but mine was theodicy. It really took me from a place where, the initial book that Sherry mentioned, uh, God Unbound, an evangelical reconsiders tradition in search of truth. I would say that was probably the first part of my journey, kind of deconstructing, rethinking things. And I would say, that was a few years ago, and since then, I've kind of progressed to the process camp. And I don't know that I would any longer consider myself an evangelical. Definitely still, Christian. But I think a lot of my thinking has changed and evolved over time. But for me, theodicy was what brought me to process, making sense out of why bad things can happen, why God would allow them to happen. And Process's answer was it made the most sense to me. And so diving into that, I was introduced to the thoughts of Whitehead, and a lot of his work resonated with me. It's difficult reading, but with the help of Tom and friends, I grew to understand it more and more. And then through my journey, I stumbled into this guy named Friedrich Schleiermacher, and I honestly can't say enough about the guy. Um, he just resonated very strongly with me. And I hope to get into some of his thoughts today. But as Sherry mentioned, I did dedicate a book to him, and just made a devotional out of some of his major thoughts, and a way that other people can get introduced to Schleiermacher if they're unfamiliar with him, and really explore his thinking in a practical way, that we can apply to our daily spiritual journeys and lives. So um, ultimately, I would say what resonated between Whitehead and Schleiermacher and and myself was this whole talk on the experience of faith. And it's the one thing that would bring a thinker like Whitehead, an out of the box thinker like Whitehead, and a reformed theologian like Schleiermacher together, was their shared emphasis on the experience of faith. So, without further ado, I guess I'd like to just go through some slides and talk about that. I titled this talk "Faith and Feeling." Um, I want to say that I've learned a little bit from my deconstructing hell talk last year. So if you guys joined in on that, I definitely was a little heavy on the content and light on the conversation afterwards. I really want this to be minimal content, enough to really kind of get my major themes or points across. But I would love for this to be more application and discussion oriented, because I really think that's where this lands, right? I think Whitehead is really good at landing in the practical, or applying Whitehead, really gets to kind of the practical day to day, for us, and so Schleiermacher does as well. So let's just kind of jump in. The first thing I want to talk through is just the process theology and experience. Obviously, if we know Whitehead at all, we know he had a lot to say about experience. Specifically, I'll talk about the concept of pan-experientialism. And I will say in these first two sections, it might get a little technical. I think it's by necessity, but we'll get through that as fast as possible. And again, just kind of get to the meat of the conversation soon enough. But we'll then talk about God and experience, and what does process philosophy have to say about how God's self experiences. I then want to introduce to you Friedrich Schleiermacher, talk a little bit about who he is, his big ideas, and what he had to say about religion and what is the essence of religion. We'll then talk about Schleiermacher and the experience of faith, and how he really thought that the meaningfulness in faith comes through our experience of it, and not through doctrines and dogmas. And so we'll take that to relate Schleiermacher to process thought, and then we'll just kind of, dive in and spend the rest of our time on some practical implications. So without further ado, we'll talk a little bit about process theology and experience. And I apologize. This is where it gets a little technical, but for those interested or familiar with process thought, I don't think there'll be too many new concepts for you. But really, Whitehead's process thought is collected into three major works. So the first interactive section here. Does anybody know the three major works of Whitehead that are said to embody his what has become known as his process philosophy? Um, Dive in and feel free to answer if you know. Process and reality, absolutely.
Adventures of Ideas.
Adventures of ideas, and there's one more.
Science in the modern world.
It would be considered, yeah, science in the modern world. So those he would consider his the three collective works that he spoke to, or um that he put out there, that were basically lectures, compiled lectures of his, but he would consider those as that which serves to express a way of understanding the nature of things, and he would call them a survey of the mutations of human experience. So in the last of the three, in Adventures of Ideas, that's how he would describe those three together. But really, in his masterwork, Process and Reality, that became the foundational work of this perennial ontology, which he would christen his philosophy of organism. So in this 400-page volume, he lays out in intricate detail support for his claim, and this is the major claim, that the most fundamental element of existence is not substance, it's not matter, but it is experience. So in Whitehead, we talk about, in process thought, and then in Whitehead, we talk about becoming over being. So not a static state, but a process of development. And then we would certainly talk about experience being more greater than or more fundamental than substance. And I guess a good illustration of that would be, to talk about the inadequacy of the atomic model. So maybe if we go back to thousands of years ago, we'd pick up a rock and say, well, the most fundamental element of this rock is the rock, right? Or maybe the chunks of the rock, or the pieces of the rock. In the early 1800s, when we discovered that these rocks were made up of atoms, we would say that the most fundamental elements of the rock were the atoms. In the late 1800s, I think the 1880s, 1890s, when we discovered that atoms were made up of neutrons, protons, electrons, we would say the most fundamental element are these subatomic particles. But as science developed and these subatomic particles, got split into these into further things like neutrinos, and again, just further divisions, we found out quickly that we can no longer describe them well by their physical properties. Instead of saying this atom is here, we can't really say that about an electron. We talk about an area that it could be in. We could see it jumping from one area to the next, but we were less able to apply Newtonian physics, I guess, to our scientific method. We were more able to describe them by what they did and less by what they were, if that makes sense. So what I would say is substances are always constituted by their experience. So if we don't have experience, we don't have a substance. So I think, therefore, we could say that experience is always more fundamental than the substance doing the experiencing. So if we were to think like that, then gosh, that really fundamentally changes how we view things. And so in order to describe all of that, we needed a new vocabulary. And so that's where Whitehead came up with a lot of cool stuff and made up some words, but stuff that we use today, when we talk about process thought. But he would say that fundamental to his thinking would be the concept of the actual entity, which he would say is a drop of experience. The actual entities are complex, they're interdependent. We would also call them actual occasions. And it includes a vast amount of things, right? So it includes something like as insignificant and momentary as a puff of smoke would be an actual entity that experiences. We would also say that God's self, is an actual entity, something as complex as the divine. So that would be what he would use to describe um, the basic element of existence. And then he would say that this concept of prehension would be the only subordinate element of an actual entity. So if we have an experience of an occasion, then the feeling of that occasion, or if we have an experience, then the experience of that experience or the feeling of that occasion would then be what he would title a prehension. And so again, some just basic elements of process thought, but the most fundamental element of being isn't necessarily the atom. He would say it's the actual entity, and how actual entities relate to each other is through the concept of prehension. But it has to do with feeling, it has to do with experience. It doesn't have to do with substance or matter. So if you haven't followed me completely so far, you're not alone. So here's a couple of famous quotes that I think you might relate to. Shaler Matthews once said when he tried to read Whitehead that it's infuriating, I must say embarrassing as well, to read page after page of relatively familiar words without understanding a single sentence. And a lot of people who've tried to read Process and Reality could probably resonate with that comment. Henry Nelson Wyman famously said, not many people will read Whitehead's recent book, and he's talking about Process and Reality in this generation. Not many people will read it in any generation, but its influence, the basic concepts of feeling, of experience, of that being the fundamental aspect of who we are and of nature itself, would radiate through concentric circles of popularization until common man will think and work in light of it, not knowing whence that light came. After a few decades of discussion and analysis, one will be able to understand it more readily than it could be done now. And so Whitehead, I think, is best understood through the disciples, I suppose, of Whitehead, who would then flesh out his theory, flesh out his thoughts. And I honestly think that his thoughts are a little more intuitive than they are readily explainable or understandable. But I do resonate with a lot of what Wyman just said there. So if you remember nothing out of the basic concepts of this process thought, but one thing, it would be pan-experientialism, that all things experience. And so I will say that pan-experientialism is not Whitehead's word. So my second part of my quiz to you folks is whose word was pan-experientialism. So I think panpsychism would probably predate pan-experientialism. But someone, said that pan-experientialism probably describes things a little bit better, popularized it. Does anybody know who that person is?
Was that Griffin?
It is David Ray Griffin. Absolutely. Good job, sir. But it's the doctrine that all actual entities, right, the basic element of all things, all actual entities have at least some modicum of experience. So these experiences can be conscious, and process thought would talk about consciousness in an evolutionary standpoint, tend not to be dualistic in their thinking from the standpoint of the material and mental. It would be more of a monistic thought or a monism, but it can be conscious or it can be non-conscious. How do we experience then in process thought? So the actual occasions that, you could say that the actual occasions that I prehend or that I experience are the basic building blocks of who I am, or of my being. And that which others prehend of me contributes to who they are. So again, we experience each other, and that is fundamental to who we are as human beings. In this sense, process philosophy emphasizes the interconnectedness of existence in a fashion that traditional notions of reality just don't. And ultimately, we can say that we are interconnected and experiential beings who are composed primarily of that which we experience. And again, that being more fundamental than any substance that we are comprised of. So how does God fit into the whole thought here? And so we've already said that in process thought, God is an actual entity. So we know that God prehends in process thought, God feels, God experiences the surrounding world. And we can also say that our experience of God contributes to who we are, and God's experience of us is fundamental of and contributes to who God is. And so the whole concept that process has of objective immortality, regardless of whether or not you would believe in a subjective immortality or a conscious existence after death, all process thinkers would hold to this thing of objective immortality, that whatever we do on this earth is taking up into God and becomes a fundamental part of God because it is something that God experiences. It is basic then or fundamental to who God is, if that makes sense. So again, God's experience of us and our experience of God are fundamental to who we are. So what the heck does all this have to do with an 18th century Reformed theologian who predated Whitehead by more than 100 years? So let's talk about this guy named Friedrich Schleiermacher and who he was. So he was born in 1768 in Breslau, Germany. He is the son of a Reformed preacher with a strong pietist background. So for those unfamiliar, pietism will be pretty fundamental to who Schleiermacher is throughout his whole life, through his education, through his deconstruction of the faith of his father to building out a faith of his own. He would always retain this pietism, and what pietism does is it places more of an emphasis on personal faith, of living a life of holiness, of reverence, of interacting with God through prayer, through studying the Bible, through worship. And so it places more of an emphasis on what we do over what exactly we believe, if that makes sense. So that's really the background he comes from. Even though he's Reformed, he has an extreme and really a committed pietistic background, similar to his father and his grandfather before him. So, but he was born into the Enlightenment period. So for those familiar with Enlightenment, you know that Immanuel Kant was also a key player in the Enlightenment. And so he defines the motivating force behind Enlightenment thinking as humankind's desire to be released from this, what he calls self-inflicted immaturity, which he says is demonstrated by the inability to use one's own understanding without the guidance of another. And so in Enlightenment thinking, things like church tradition, dogma, doctrine, he sees them as superstitious, right? He sees them as relics of the past, that there isn't truth unless we can reason ourselves to that truth. So he kind of takes religion, and this would be indicative of Enlightenment thought as a whole, to take religion and to replace it by reason. Okay. So Schleiermacher, with his pietistic background, said, well, wait a second. I don't think he would say religion and reason would be a false dichotomy. He would say dogmas, opinions, are not the fundamental building blocks of religion. And so he would famously say in his book, in the first book that really put him on the map from the standpoint of theology and philosophy, it was called On Religion, Speeches to Its Cultured Despisers. He would say, if you have only given attention to these dogmas and the opinions, therefore, you do not yet know religion itself, and what you despise is not it. In fact, he would go on to say, religion for you is at one time a way of thinking, a particular way to contemplate the world, as well as a particular way of acting, a special kind of conduct and character. He would say, I consider it very wrong out of things so desperate as modes of knowing and modes of acting that you patch together an untenable something and call it religion, right? He came down on this, like you can't reason yourself to religion. Okay, we're going to disagree on dogmas, doctrines. It's not a way of acting in a particular way. It's not a particular way of conducting ourselves. Okay, you're missing the point. So, what did he say religion was? Well, Schleiermacher said, at its basic fundamental essence, religion was a sense and a taste for the infinite. And he would say that religion is to seek this and to find it in all that lives and moves. It is to have life and to know it an immediate feeling, only as such an existence in the eternal and in the infinite. So hopefully you're starting to see where we're connecting process thought and Schleiermacher here. Religion is not primarily what we believe to be about God. At its core, it is experiencing God. It is the experience of God. And what he accomplishes in reframing religion in this way, and this is what makes him such an important thinker, is that it provided a key apologetic to faith, right? We didn't have to reason our way to Kant through Hume or whatever to why religion is important. It took we could say it's important because it is fundamental to our experience, but then also it took religion out of the realm of Enlightenment deconstruction, where we cannot reason away religion because religion doesn't belong there. So he provides an apologetic to faith, but then he also takes it out of the conversation of the Enlightenment deconstruction period, which placed such a high emphasis on reason. So religion to Schleiermacher belongs in the realm of experience. So what he would talk about is he would talk about, again, the experience of faith, and he would talk about knowing life in immediate feeling. And so the next thing we would have to ask ourselves is, what exactly did Schleiermacher mean by feeling? Because when we think about feeling today, we might have this sensate perception of feeling, where we experience emotion or a touch, right? And he'd say that's not really what he meant by it. And so he would use this German word Gefühl, and he would call Gefühl a dispassionate gentleness, right? And he would say that it's the capability of knowing and acting on a situation's highest good. That was his original usage of Gefühl. As he developed in his thinking, he would say that his Gefühl is maybe more equated to our intuition. And then in the most developed versions of Schleiermacher, in his writings of On Religion and the Monologion afterwards, and then his dogmatic tome, The Christian Faith, Gefühl really becomes the foundational principle of religion itself. And so it's non-sensate, but it's instinctual. So when he says to have life and to know life in immediate feeling, he's talking about this non-sensate form of feeling. So the best way that I would think to describe it, or that allows me to kind of wrap my brain around what a non-sensate feeling is maybe the feeling of, let's say we close our eyes and we think of our brains, right? How do we know that our brain is in our head? We can't see it. Most of us, unless we've had some sort of CAT scan or MRI, have never seen it. But all of us knows with absolute certainty that our brain is in our head, right? And it's instinctual to us. And perhaps you can say that if you think about it, you can feel it, but it's certainly not a sensate feeling. It's more of something that comes up out of our instincts. Okay, that's the way that Schleiermacher would describe the feeling in the experience of God that he would say is so fundamental to faith. And he would ultimately say that the essence of religion itself is attaining what he would say is the feeling of absolute dependence on God. And so, what we would not only to experience God, but to experience God in such a way that we would see God as the person in whom we live and move and have our being, right? The person we rely on, the creator. That is what religion is. Okay, it's not the doctrines and dogmas that surround it. And he would say that this feeling takes the place for the system of doctrine of all the so-called proofs of the existence of God. So those of us, who are into maybe apologetics or, talk about proof of the existence of God, we talk about the ontological argument, we talk about the teleological argument. He would say that's hogwash compared to the evidence that we personally have through experiencing God. And that is the most important evidence of who God is. So how does this all connect with process? I think we can easily make some of those connections. Both Schleiermacher and Whitehead affirm that the essence of existence is based on experience via feeling. To Whitehead, it's not substance. To Schleiermacher, it's not reason or dogma, right? They would both say that the essence of existence is experience. For both Whitehead and Schleiermacher, feeling is non-sensate, but it is still experiential, right? It's not emotional, but it's something that we experience. And for both Whitehead and Schleiermacher, feeling is emergent. So it's something that that emerges out of who we are, that develops as we become conscious beings. Whitehead would describe feelings as prehensions. Schleiermacher would use this term he would call, and he made it up, but it's called the Napunkt. And Whitehead made up prehensions. So I suppose it's all on the same playing field there. So again, to both Schleiermacher and Whitehead, who we are is made up of experience, and our faith is primarily defined by experience. So in this last section, I just kind of want to open it up to conversation.